All right, welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is going to be Module 7 on social justice, and this is going to be the last lecture. So we are wrapping things up here, and there are no quizzes and no discussions for this module. We are focused 100% on your final paper. And the purpose of this lecture and of the various handouts that I'm going to provide and the reading materials is to give you ideas for choosing your topic related to global ethics, 3 ethical issues that are related to that topic, and 2 philosophers or philosophical systems through which to examine these ethical issues with regard to some issue of global ethics. So hopefully this will be helpful for doing that. I highly recommend you look at the study guide that I'm going to send out this week, which is a very detailed breakdown of what the paper should look like. And with that said, let's jump into it. So when we hear phrases like the arc of history bends towards justice, I mean, we've all heard that one at some point. What sort of claim exactly is being made here? What sort of claim exactly are we encountering? Jean-Francois Lyotard famously defined postmodern philosophy, or the postmodern condition, as a characteristic attitude of what he called incredulity or critical skepticism towards what he calls meta-narratives. Now, what is that? A meta-narrative is a sort of comprehensive explanatory framework. It's this grand story that attempts to give meaning and structure to all of human history, right? And in this course, we've looked at several challenges to entrenched meta-narratives. So back in Module 1, when Bertrand Russell asks if practical knowledge is the only kind of knowledge that matters, he's challenging a meta-narrative of instrumental utilitarianism or pragmatism. In Module 2, when Karenyi asks whether science can ever be value neutral, she's disrupting a meta-narrative of this idea of detached scientific objectivity, that science can never, in any true sense, be truly apolitical. In Module 3, when Narayan insists that access to some types of knowledge depends upon relative social position, she's undermining this meta-narrative of epistemic universalism, right, where everyone has equal access to knowledge. And in Module 4, when Montero wonders what constitutes a physical fact, she's perhaps destabilizing our most fundamental meta-narrative about material reality itself. And as we've seen these meta-narratives be challenged, we've also witnessed the birth of other meta-narratives being born and created. Consider the various ways in which we've seen the search for knowledge positioned or presented as this kind of quest for certainty. And this term comes from the pragmatist philosopher John Dewey. The quest for certainty, which is this pursuit of some objective standpoint beyond all possible doubt or subjectivity from which we might survey and judge the world as if from outside of it. Now, for the empiricist, they're going to ground this certainty in the correspondence between ideas and an external reality, between ideas and external reality. Rationalists are going to locate it in the internal coherence of logical systems, right? But both traditions ultimately are embracing what Dewey calls the spectator theory of knowledge, which imagines a detached observer who evaluates whether it's sensory data or innate ideas, evaluates them from this objective standpoint that's positioned somehow outside of experience itself. And so we're back inside the Cartesian theater. In this case, we're again the spectral spectator, sitting alone, autonomous, godlike, passing judgment from this throne of speculative neutrality. Now, in Module 6, Virginia Held offered a challenge to this notion of an objective, disengaged spectator who evaluates ethical claims according to abstract, rational, universal laws. And in this module, she's going to expand that critique by calling into question the foundational social meta-narratives that lie at the heart of much of Western civilization. But to get there, we got to start at the beginning. And that means going back to Plato. So Plato makes the mythic nature of social narratives social meta-narratives pretty explicit in the Republic when he self-consciously crafts what he calls a noble lie, right? That is intended to secure generations of social stability at the price of a rigid class hierarchy. So, the version of Socrates that we meet in the Republic is almost certainly a mouthpiece for the philosophy of the mature Plato. So we're not, most scholars I think agree, we're not hearing the voice of Socrates here. We're hearing Plato. And the topic of the dialogue is justice. And Plato chooses to illustrate his theory of justice and the theory of forms that stands behind it, using the example of a speculative utopia, which is this imagined perfect society. You can probably think of many literary examples of utopias, and Plato's Republic was actually the first. It's the opposite of a dystopia, which is an imagined sort of, maximally imperfect nightmare future society. So Plato's Republic is meant to be a utopia, a perfected society that embodies the form of justice. But this perfected society for Plato is not a democracy. It is explicitly not a democracy. Plato compares democratic rule to a ship with no captain, right? Where every crew member is fighting for control of the wheel. And the ship of state, and he's thinking of society in terms of states, like city-states like Athens. The ship of state needs a firm and capable hand. It needs a captain at the wheel. For this reason, Plato argues that the ship of state should have rule by meritocracy. And meritocracy is where leadership is determined by ability, expertise, and wisdom, by merit, essentially. Rule by the best, right? By the most meritorious. And this sets up Plato's probably most famous contribution to philosophy, possibly the most famous philosophy thought experiment of all time, which is the allegory of the cave. So, some version of this story has been retold again and again. Its DNA runs through Descartes' demon deceiver and Hilary Putnam's brain in a vat thought experiment, and perhaps most famously, recently in films like The Matrix and The Truman Show. Plato, in Plato's version, he imagines an underground cave, right? So you've got an underground cave, and inside, prisoners are chained in front of a wall. From behind them, and out of sight, their captors are casting shadows upon the wall. It's the shadow play, the sort of shadow puppetry that's playing out on the screen of the wall in front of them. Sound effects, fully immersive, the equivalent of like IMAX or VR from Plato's time. And the prisoners, who see only the shadows on the wall, mistake this for the real world. Then one day, one of the prisoners escapes and crawls out of the cave, leaving behind the illusion of the false shadow world, and emerges for the first time into the blinding light of reality. Like Neo being unplugged from the Matrix. He escapes from the illusion and sees the world for how it truly is. The prisoner witnesses the truth behind all appearances. The world beyond the Cartesian theater. The reality behind the veil of perception. The world, according to Plato, the world of the forms. So when Socrates asks Glaucon in the Republic for the meaning of justice, he's not asking for an example of a just act, right? He's searching for the ideal form of justice itself, the essence that identifies virtuous acts as virtuous, and of which every individual act of justice represents an imperfect copy. So the truth behind appearances for Plato is essentially reality perfected. And everything we see, all the appearances, are copies that represent this perfected reality. And there's something intuitive to this when you think about it, because we recognize something essential that, think about someone drawing a circle. It's going to be an imperfect circle. No one ever draws a perfect circle. But there's something essential that marks every imperfectly drawn circle as sharing something like a common circularity. there is some sort of notion of a common circularity that precedes this imperfectly drawn circle, right? Some form or idea of perfect circularity has to exist prior to any individual drawing the circle in order for us to recognize it as a circle. And for Plato, this intuition holds universally. So, for everything. So, like the prisoner escaping from the shadow play in the cave, the philosopher, through reasoning, of course, escapes from the illusion of appearances and beholds the perfection of the forms themselves, the ideal perfected version of reality. Which is why they should lead society. And that is why Plato believes that only philosophers possess the wisdom to steer the ship of state. The meritocracy of the Republic is to be ruled by a class of philosopher kings. To accomplish this, Plato devises what's become known as the myth of metals. And this is the noble lie that has to be agreed upon and repeated generation after generation. Everyone has to buy in on this and just reiterate it and reproduce it over and over again so it'll take hold. And the idea of the myth of metals is that every citizen is born with their essence mixed with one of four metals, either gold, silver, iron, or bronze. And these metals mark the innate skills of the individual and fix their place within the perfect order of society. So gold is the metal of the philosopher kings. If your soul is mixed with gold, then you are born to rule. Silver is the metal of the militia, who are born to execute the will of the philosopher kings. And iron and bronze are the metals of the farmers and craftsmen, respectively, who are born to perform their duties and to obey their philosopher kings. So, Plato asks us to crawl out of the shadowy theater of the cave, only to then ask us to build a new illusion for the world to inhabit. We escape the cave, we escape the illusion of the shadow play on the wall, and we get out of there through reason. And where does reason lead us? To build a new illusion. To build the myth of the metals in order to ensure social stability by creating this false meta-narrative that keeps people locked into a rigid class hierarchy over generations. So, from our perspective, golden souls and philosopher kings doesn't sound too persuasive. That's probably, the myth of metals is probably not going to work in the 21st century. But the idea of meritocracy, that's still around. The notion that we should be ruled by the best of the best. And Plato's notion that a perfect society would be one in which every citizen is performing the duty for which they are most perfectly suited, because that's the key insight to what Plato's doing here. I mean, isn't there something intuitive about that? Don't we want those with the greatest skill to perform the most important duties, right? But maybe we're too cynical for that now. Maybe we've grown cynical about the capabilities of kings in this regard specifically. I mean, we are children of the modern age, right? All of us. We understand that social harmony can only be achieved once people set aside their inherent self-interest and come together in a spirit of collaboration and negotiation. If we're to achieve a just and secure society, some measure of freedom must be sacrificed by all. So, guided by reason, we seek a rational compromise that will benefit everyone. Thomas Hobbes, we're jumping ahead to the back to the early modern period. So Thomas Hobbes paints a vivid picture of a world that doesn't have that sort of rational compromise. What he calls the state of nature, and that's where we all start out for Hobbes, is the state of nature, which he describes as a world of perpetual conflict. Every individual is driven into competition by the scarcity of basic resources. There's not enough to go around, so everyone has to fight over resources. And we're all driven by the impulse for self-preservation, which is a rational impulse. And as a result, individual life is, in his words, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And humans are forced into this never-ending war of all against all, which would be a great metal album title. But that's what Hobbes sees as the state of nature that we're escaping by coming together and sacrificing freedoms to achieve security, as is this war, this perpetual conflict, the war of all against all. So to escape this fate, reason demands that we seek peace, right? And to achieve and to keep this peace, we must be willing to sacrifice some rights and freedoms. We must be willing to freely enter into contracts with one another as autonomous agents, negotiating our relative freedoms relative to one another in order to maximize both our own self-interest and the security and benefit of the whole, of all, of everyone. So for Hobbes, the very act of forming a society entails that we must enter into a social contract. That by being a part of society, we've already agreed to a social contract. That's implicit in the very existence of a society. That we must be bound by force if necessary to keep our contracts. That's what holds society together. That's what keeps the peace. That's what keeps us out of the war of all against all. Now, to enforce these contracts, someone's got to enforce it, right? Hobbes argues that we need what he calls the Leviathan, which is an absolute sovereign, a ruler with unlimited power to enforce compliance with the social contract in order to protect us from ourselves. So benevolent paternalism through crushing authoritarian force. Later contract theorists like Locke and Rousseau, John Locke, who you remember back from Module 3, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we're not covering, unfortunately, in any detail. But they would go on to develop less authoritarian versions of the idea of the social contract. But the core concept has stuck around, and it remains intact today, that legitimate political power derives from the consent of individuals who voluntarily sacrifice some freedom for security. And yet, even when we do so, even when we keep faith with the law and with the social contract and dutifully sacrifice our liberty for security, we still find that security, that resources and wealth and access to services and things like that doesn't appear to be distributed evenly, right? The playing field doesn't seem remotely fair, does it? A person born into a community that has inherited wealth, status, and socio-political influence accumulated over generations experiences a vastly different world of opportunities than a person born into relative generational poverty. So, can we look at that kind of inequality and call that justice? Well, John Rawls is going to try to answer that question, and he's going to ask us to consider what sorts of principles rational individuals would voluntarily choose if they were designing a society from behind what he calls a veil of ignorance, which is it's this thought experiment of like a veil that prevents you from knowing in advance what your place in society is going to be. So you don't know what your class will be, your race, your gender, your talent, or your ability, anything that would bias you in one direction or another when deciding how resources would be distributed. And he calls this the original position, not because it's an actual historical position, but it's a thought experiment that's designed to sort of capture our intuitions around fairness. So if no one knows, this is the idea, if no one knows in advance whether a particular choice will lead to their advantage or to their disadvantage, then self-interest is removed from the equation, right? And we can arrive at something like a rational principle of justice as fairness. Now, from the original position, Rawls is going to argue that rational people would choose two principles. One, the primary one, is equal liberty, which is that each person should have the greatest amount of liberty that is compatible with similar liberties for all. Two is what's called the difference principle, that social and economic inequalities are justified, but only if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. So those are the two principles that Rawls is going to say allows us to ensure a just distribution of resources. Now, the result of these principles is a social contract, once again, that ensures equality of opportunity for everyone. So everyone should have, under Rawls' system here, an equal opportunity to access resources, including those beginning from a position of relative social or economic disadvantage. But of course, equality of opportunity does not guarantee equality of outcome, right? Just because everyone has an equal opportunity doesn't mean everyone's going to arrive at the same place. Everyone's going to end up with the same distribution of resources, right? Everyone's going to end up in the same situation, the same outcome. And any attempt at making the distribution of resources, any attempt to make that match some ideal pattern, right? Which is what he's proposing. This is like an ideal pattern of how resources would be distributed. Any attempt to like enforce that is going to necessarily involve the interference of some centralized government authority, right? To actually do the redistributing. And this is the direction that Robert Nozick is going to criticize him from. So Nozick argues that any such redistribution of wealth is going to necessarily violate the rights of individuals to freely acquire and transfer their property as they wish. To preserve the just entitlements of individuals to their property, Nozick is going to counter with three principles which he collectively believes establishes an entitlement theory, what he calls an entitlement theory of justice. So these are, the first one is justice in acquisition. And that is that the initial acquisition of resources has to be just. You have to have acquired your property through just means. You can't have done that unfairly or through unjust practices. Second is justice in transfer, which is all exchanges of resources must be voluntary in order for them to be just. They can't be coercive. You can't steal someone's money at gunpoint. It has to be something that is consented to. And three is rectification of injustice, which means that past injustices in acquisition or transfer have to be corrected in order for justice to be preserved. And so collectively, Nozick is going to argue that these three principles, justice in acquisition, justice in transfer, and rectification of injustice, establish both necessary and sufficient conditions for justice. And he's going to illustrate this case with a famous example involving the basketball star Wilt Chamberlain, who some of you may remember. So Chamberlain signs a contract that stipulates that he will only play in games where fans voluntarily consent to pay an additional charge directly to him for the privilege of watching him play. Now, over time, as fans voluntarily consent to transfer their wealth directly to Wilt Chamberlain in order to watch him play, a pattern spontaneously emerges where wealth is disproportionately distributed away from the fans and to Chamberlain, which creates a situation, a pattern of massive wealth inequality. Now, is this a problem? According to Nozick, despite the inequality, this distribution, this pattern, is justice preserving because it emerges from voluntary exchanges between consenting individuals. So it satisfies justice in acquisition and justice in transfer. And to attempt to redistribute this wealth to create a more equitable pattern would represent injustice, in Nozick's opinion, insofar as it would require the continuous interference of a centralized authority to do the redistributing. Now, Nozick argues instead for what he calls a minimalist or libertarian, his term is night watchman state, which limits government authority to securing the property rights of citizens. That's it. That's government's job, is to protect people's property. None of this redistributing wealth stuff. No social welfare or safety net. Now, let's look back at Nozick's third principle here, the rectification of injustice. Past injustices in acquisition or transfer must be corrected. That one seems, when viewed through the lens of history, to be a little bit problematic, right? How is this night watchman state supposed to address historical wrongs like slavery or colonialism or genocide, whose effects continue to shape contemporary society? Now, Bernard R. Boxill is going to take up this question in his argument for reparations to Black Americans for the historical injustice of slavery. And Boxill is going to illustrate his case through use of an analogy. So Tom owns a bicycle, right? And Dick steals the bicycle. It's Tom's bicycle, Dick steals it. Seems to follow that justice would dictate in this case that Dick owes the bicycle to Tom. It's Tom's bicycle, Dick stole it. Dick owes Tom a bicycle and an apology and an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Similarly, if Dick, after he steals the bicycle from Tom, he then gives the stolen bike to Harry, then Harry now owes the bike to Tom. It's still Tom's bike. And once Harry learns that the bike was stolen, even though he was personally innocent, he didn't have anything to do with the theft, but still, he receives stolen property, and once he learns that, he owes that property back to the rightful owner, which is Tom. And if Tom dies, and he stipulates in his will, he leaves a will that leaves the bicycle to his son Jim, then Harry owes the bicycle to Jim. Again, even though Harry had nothing to do with the original theft, he still received the stolen property that should have rightfully belonged to Tom, and that Tom rightfully passed down to his son Jim. So Harry owes the bike to Jim. And Boxill is going to argue that that same logic applies to wealth that was produced by enslaved Africans and stolen by white American slave owners and passed down over generations to their descendants, creating systems of massive inequality that massively benefit one community and disempower another. Contemporary Black Americans, as descendants of those whose labor was stolen, are entitled to compensation for that historical injustice. Now, Chandran Kukathis is going to point out that this approach faces challenges from the perspectives of both justice and practical implementation. Kukathis is going to argue that preserving justice in this case entails being able to clearly distinguish between those who are a clear descendant of the historical victims of the original injustice and those who are the clear descendants of the historical perpetrators of the injustice. So the people who are the clearly descendants of the people who are the victims, and people who are, you have to be able to distinguish between them and the people who are clearly descendants of the people who are the perpetrators in order to determine who owes who, right? Now, Boxill is able to sort of work around this difficulty by stipulating that the debt is actually incurred by the whole of the white community, considered as a corporate entity that has collectively benefited from the original injustice. But Kukathis is going to counter that identifying which individuals are members of particular communities is not such a simple matter. And he's going to cite complicating factors such as generations of intermarriage, right? The complicity of foreign interests, descendants who can trace their lineage to both perpetrators and victims, changes over time in the political and cultural definitions which stipulate membership in racialized groups, which does change over time, the status of immigrant groups admitted after the original injustice, and the potential for legitimate claims of competing harms incurred by members of other historically marginalized groups. So how do you account for all those factors? It suddenly becomes very complicated. What appears on its face as a clear and abhorrent breach of the social contract unearths this tangle of uncertainties regarding identity and culpability. Now, Boxill's corporate model of racialized group culpability is complicated by the historically arbitrary and inconsistent application of racialized categories. And if you look at our survey of professional philosophers that I'm going to send out this week, a strong majority, 63.4%, of respondents consider the categories of race to reflect social consensus rather than biological facts. Biological fact comes in at 18.7%. That's pretty low. 63.4% agree that race is a social construct. So, but regardless of whether the meta-narrative of group racialization is grounded in nature or culture, whether it's a social construct or a biological fact, it's still inarguable that the technology of racialization, that identifying people as members of racialized groups, was employed as a tool to steal the wealth generated by the labor of marginalized groups and to transfer, compound, and centralize that wealth over the course of generations, generating this institutionalized, normalized, and continuously reproduced cycle of intergenerational poverty that continues to materially harm Black American communities to this day. So the question arises then, are there other possible lenses beyond the meta-narrative of the social contract that we might use to make sense of these complications that arise when the individual is positioned as the fundamental unit of society? Now, we've traced the development of the contractualist tradition from Plato's original Noble Lie to Hobbes's Leviathan, and onward through contemporary debates surrounding distributive justice and historical reparations. And each of these thinkers, in their own way, has asked the question, how do we build a society from autonomous individuals, a just society? What sacrifices of liberty must be made? How should resources be distributed? And what rights must be protected? And though these theories might disagree on the terms of the contract, they rarely question the core conceptual framework itself, which has pretty much dominated Western political philosophy for centuries now. But, as Virginia Held notes, this contractual model, it appears natural to us only because it has been elevated to the status of common sense, to the status of a universal truth. In fact, this tradition has always contained a very conspicuous blind spot in that it systematically excludes the experiences and perspectives of women, particularly of mothers. Now, according to Held, this exclusion is not incidental. It's structural. It's built in. The model of homo economicus, which refers to this notion of the rational, self-interested actor who is engaging in this perpetual negotiation of contracts to advance his personal interests. This is always, from Held's perspective, and she's building off the work of other people here, has always been explicitly gendered from its inception. It was always already framed in these terms. The public sphere of politics, economics, and law has been traditionally understood as the domain of men. Women, meanwhile, are relegated to the private sphere of the family and the home. And this private sphere is not merely separate, but subordinate, right? In contrast to the abstract rationalism of homo economicus, of the rational, autonomous, self-interested agent, women are characterized as being closer to nature, guided more by biological instinct than by practical reason. And from the perspective of homo economicus, it is reason that establishes us as fully human. So if you are saying that women are closer to nature and guided more by biological instinct than by practical reason, you are, in a sense, denying their full humanity. Consider the starting premise of each theory we've looked at. Plato begins with the philosopher gazing upon the ideal realm of perfected forms. Hobbes starts with isolated individuals thrust into a bloody and chaotic state of nature. Rawls positions his hypothetical rational social engineers behind a veil of ignorance. Nozick bases his theory upon the claims of entitlement that individuals have to their property. And even discussions of reparations between Boxall and Koukouthis assume identifiable victims and perpetrators as the primary units of analysis. But in the private sphere of mothers and children, there is no formal contract, right? There's no explicitly negotiated terms, no bargaining between autonomous agents, and yet this mother-child relationship, is the foundation of human society in a strictly literal sense. It is where all of this literally emerged from. So we are far from the detached objective observer within the Cartesian theater. And Held's care ethics is going to change that meta-narrative to begin with bodily reality, the physical dependency of infants, the embodied labor of mothering, the material needs that must be met for survival. We enter the world always already embedded within reciprocal relationships of care. And our identities, our capacities, and even our ability to reason develop within and through these relationships. They don't pre-exist them. Care is not the application of pre-existing principles, but a dynamic engagement that generates meaning through action. It's practical. It's praxis. It's an ongoing process of intra-relational co-creation. I'm using the term intra-relational from Karen Barad. The mother and child do not exist as ontologically isolated agents. They think with and through one another, anticipating needs, adapting to responses, a relationship that exceeds bodily boundaries and to coexist in the relational space between bodies, between individuals. It's relational all the way down. We don't come into this from outside and figure out how to form a community. We start as a community and then figure out how to form individuals from that. We've been looking at it through the wrong side of the lens. So Held is not merely suggesting that we should add care ethics as the sort of supplement to contractualist theory. It's like an add-on. Her project is not reformist. Her project is revolutionary. Our task should be to reclaim embodied experience from the margins and install it as the center of ethical and political theory. Rather than allowing the logic of the marketplace to colonize the home, we should instead expand the embodied, embedded, enactive, and extended ethics of the home into our political and economic institutions. And again, there are those 4 E's that we encountered in modules 4 and 5. Embodied, embedded, enactive, and extended. And for those of you on the psychology path, you will probably encounter those terms again. So where contractualism begins with separation and then seeks to build connection, care ethics begins with connection and then negotiates appropriate separation. How do you become an individual when emerging from this always already interrelated reciprocal care relationship? Such a world must recognize that dependency and vulnerability are not exceptional conditions, but constitutive features of human existence. Justice should not be primarily about respecting boundaries and honoring agreements or property rights, but about responding to needs and fostering relationships. Society's aim should not be securing non-interference, right? But ensuring active support for human flourishing. Eudaimonia, yet again. Power should be reconceived not as dominion or domination over others, but as the capacity to empower them. But in the end, we don't actually believe in the existence of the social contract, right? Even Hobbes didn't actually believe in a social contract. There's not a literal contract that everyone comes together and signs. It's not meant to be a description. It's a formula. Act as if you are a rationally self-interested party entering into a contractual relationship. That's the formula. And it's more than a formula, it's a ritual. We reenact the illusion that we live in such a world every day in 1,000 invisible ways. We have to. Because the noble lie only works if everyone believes it. Allow a single heretic, and the whole system is put at risk. And this is why the prisoners in Plato's allegory of the cave eventually murder the philosopher when he returns to liberate them. By escaping the illusion, his very existence has become a threat to the established order. Like Socrates, the escaped prisoner must be sacrificed to feed the illusion. Myth-making requires martyrs. And yet Plato would still, recognizing this, would still enslave us to the very shadow play from which his philosopher martyr would liberate us. And what Plato crafts out of hubris, Hobbes crafts out of fear of the mob, the fear of nature. Hobbes encircles his Leviathan state with torches of reason to stave off the bloody fangs of the embodied animal beyond. Sphere of nature is what's behind that. And out of the state of nature, Homo economicus emerges, ready to sacrifice his liberty in order to make a deal. Here it is not a person who is martyred, but a principle. To live together, we must all agree to voluntarily euthanize some portion of our humanity. What that portion looks like remains always an object of negotiation. The rule of law, the Constitution, separation of powers, democracy, rituals that we recite every morning and every night. It is exhausting work holding together the narrative of the world, especially right now. But tell a good enough story, and it can overwrite the world. But you have to keep telling it. Nothing less than ceaseless vigilance will preserve it. And so, we tell the story. We tell the story when we go to work every morning. We tell it when we interrupt our children from play to remind them that they need to be on time to meet some deadline or some appointment or obligation. We are forever renegotiating the terms of the contract and scanning our surroundings for anyone who threatens to violate it. Held thinks that it's time for a new story, a new narrative, and so do I. But I don't think that a good enough story has been written yet. I think that that's your job, to write the story of the next generation. It's time to leave the cave, folks, and to become what Richard Rorty calls a strong poet, a writer not just of poems, but of worlds. The myth of metals won't do, obviously, and the social contract kind of seems to have run its course. So the question remains, what new worlds will you bear the terrible joy of writing into the book of existence? And that seems like a good place to end. I really enjoyed this class. I've really enjoyed reading your work and responding to it. And every response, makes me think through and reevaluate and look at these ideas through a different lens. And it makes me a better thinker. It makes me a better philosopher. And I thank you for that. And there have been some truly extraordinary responses who've made me rethink things and reevaluate and look at things through a different lens. And it's an honor and privilege to be able to do this. And I look forward to reading your final papers. And good luck, everybody. You know how to reach me via email, via office hours. And good luck. See you next time.